I'm back with a video about social psychology. So let me go ahead and share my screen and then I will get started. Where is my video? Okay. All right, so social psychology is chapter 12. And we're going to talk about what is social psychology, self-presentation, attitudes and persuasion. We'll talk about conformity and obedience, prejudice and discrimination, aggression and pro-social behavior. And this will come in 2 or so videos. First off, social psychology, what is it? It's how you're influenced by and how you influence other people. So people are inherently social. Other people affect us and we affect them, and that's what social psychology is about. We're going to start by talking about situationism and dispositionism. So this is the extent to which behavior is caused by either something in your situation or your disposition, what's coming from inside of you. So what we generally call in social psychology, we call the cause of a behavior an attribution. So if I say, why did I slam my hand on the desk? That would be the cause. Whatever you think is the cause, we would say is the attribution. Now, you might say that I slammed my hand on the desk because I am angry, in which case that would be the disposition or the internal part of me that made me want to slam my hand on the desk. Or others of you may say, well, she slammed her hand on the desk because there was a screw coming loose and she was using her hand as a hammer, or there was a bug on the desk or something like that, in which case that would be my situation was causing me to do that. So is it somebody's internal disposition or is it their situation that causes them to do different things? So I want to move on with that and talk a little bit about how that makes us think differently about things sometimes. We have a big problem in that we make some errors in our attributions. So we never really know why people do the things they do or why we do the things we do. So we just make up either a situation or a disposition, but we do that in certain ways. So one problem is what we call the fundamental attribution error. And that is that when we judge other people, we overestimate their disposition and we underestimate their situation. So for example, you might see this guy on the street, homeless, broke, hungry, he says, and you may think, why is he on the street? Is he on the street because he is lazy, maybe, right? Or because his situation warrants it, maybe he has a chronic disease and he cannot work, or maybe he had was put out of his home and doesn't have an address and things like that. So either it's a situational thing or it's a disposition thing, but people tend to go for the disposition. They tend to think he's lazy, he doesn't work hard, he's not very motivated, he doesn't aspire to much, and things like that. So we tend to attribute people's behavior to their personality more than we do their disposition. And this causes us to get into another problem, which is called the just world hypothesis. The just world hypothesis extends from the fundamental attribution error in the sense that people tend to blame people wherever they end up being. So the just world hypothesis states that the world is a good place where people get what they deserve. So in the same sense, if a person doesn't have a job, it must be because he didn't work hard. And that leads us to what we call victim blaming. And that happens, of course, you've heard in the case of rape, where a woman is raped and then people say, well, why were you so promiscuous, or why'd you go out late at night, and things like that. They assume that it's her problem. People end up where they are because of their own fault. And that, of course, is a myth. It is simply not true. People end up in bad situations, oftentimes for no fault of their own. Now, we take a different path when talking about our own behaviors. we take a path of the self-serving bias. So if we end up in a bad situation, we say that it's because of our situation. So, for example, if I fail a test, I will tend to say that it's the teacher, she made the test too hard, or my roommate kept me up all night. I'll tend to go for situation. But if I get an A on the test, I'll say it's because I'm so smart. It's because I'm great. It's because I learn so quickly and I understand everything, or I'm a good test taker, or whatever. With ourselves, we tend to think that it's our disposition when we succeed, but when we fail, we switch to situation there. So we are a little bit more generous with ourselves than we are with other people on that. With other people, we tend to go for disposition always. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about self-presentation. We all have a lot of different roles. For example, I'm a teacher, but I'm also a girlfriend, and I'm also a godmother, and I'm also an auntie, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we have a lot of different roles. And what happens is that we have social norms that tell us how to act in every role. So I may act differently when I'm your teacher than I act when I'm with my friends and I'm playing the role of a friend. And there was a very famous experiment called the Stanford Prison Experiment that we talked about earlier in this class. And in that experiment, what they did is they took a bunch of students, college students, and they randomly assigned them to either play the roles of prisoners or guards in a prison-like situation. And what they found is that the prisoners started acting like how you'd think prisoners should act. And the guards started acting like how you think guards should act. And in many cases, the guards became very cruel and the prisoners became very depressed. And it just kind of shows you how quickly our behavior melds to our particular kind of role that we're playing. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about attitudes and persuasion, then we'll move on to conformity and obedience. Attitude is just how positive or negative something is to you. So, for example, you may say, what is your attitude toward McDonald's? Well, I have a negative attitude about McDonald's because I think it's unhealthy and I think it's kind of gross also. And you may say, well, what is your attitude toward Lincoln University? Well, I have a really positive attitude toward Lincoln University because I think that Lincoln has an amazing and proud history and has done a lot of good things for people. So the components of an attitude involve both feelings, your emotions, your behavior, and also your thoughts. So if I have bad feelings toward McDonald's because I think it's gross or something like that or disgusting, then I won't go to McDonald's. So that'll be the behavior. And I also have thoughts about McDonald's. So I think that McDonald's, for example, is a corporate megalith that is out there to make people unhealthy. I don't know. I'm just making this up. Okay. So changes in attitudes. There are different ways to change people's attitudes. So if you have a negative attitude, we could change it to a positive, or positive to change it to a negative. And advertising uses these persuasive techniques a lot. So I want to talk to you about a couple of different ways of persuading people in advertising. One is the peripheral route. And the peripheral route is a way of changing people's attitudes by way of just kind of imagery associated with a product. So the peripheral route won't really give you any information. For example, in this Hardee's ad, they really don't give you any information. They don't even tell you what kind of sandwich it is. They're just trying to kind of make it look pretty by offering up a pretty girl and a fancy car and all of that. But they don't really give you any information. But notice this central route ad. The central route really goes for, your thinking route, your brain route. This ad is telling you that you can have gum problems and eye problems and wrinkles on your face caused by smoking. And then they tell you that cigarettes are addictive, they're harmful, and they give you some information there. So there are different ways to persuade our attitudes. We can either do it with almost no information, or we can do it with a lot of information. And the peripheral route tends to go for almost no information, where the central route tends to go with more information. Okay, I want to start talking then about conformity, compliance, and obedience. Conformity and obedience, first off. Conformity is doing what others want you to do with really no pressure. So I may, for example, color my hair because I think it's in fashion, but it's not like anybody's putting a gun to my head saying, you need to color your hair. I don't really have any real pressure to do it, any real obvious pressure, but I may feel like I should do it because I want to conform to what others do. Obedience is doing what an authority figure tells you to do. So for example, when the police tell you to pull over, you might do that because the police are an authority figure, or your teacher tells you to do something, or your mom tells you to do something. Those are all authority figures. So that is called obedience. So it's doing things that that others want you to do, but the obedience tends to have a little bit more pressure behind it because it's an authority figure telling you that. So I wanted to talk to you about two important studies, in first conformity and then one on obedience. And so the study on conformity, excuse me, trying to move something here. Oh, well, it's not working. Okay. The study on conformity, what they did is they had an exhibitor, which is like a teacher, and they showed people this square there. They showed exhibit 1 and then exhibit 2. And all you had to do was say which of the lines in exhibit 2 matches the line in exhibit 1. And of course, the answer there is A. Okay, but it was a little bit more complicated than that. What they did is they had a group of people sitting around, and you would be like, the participant would be like person number 5 or something like that, right? But there would be 6 people sitting there, and they would go around the room and they would say, what's the right answer? And people would say, like they would start saying C. And then the next person, what's the right answer? They would say C. And the next person, what's the right answer? They would say C. And so then it gets to you. And while you know that the answer there is A, you might think, maybe I should say C. And so that the extent to which people did that in this experiment was what we measured as conformity. Now, this experiment showed that 75% of people will say a wrong answer to conform with the rest of the group. So if the rest of the group is saying the wrong answer, they'll say the wrong answer too, even though it defies their eyes, like it makes no sense. It's obviously the wrong answer. They will still say the wrong answer to go along with the group. And this is conformity again, because there's no authority figure there. Nobody's got a gun to your head. You're not going to, nothing bad is going to happen if you say the right answer. But yet still most people will conform in that situation. There are some people that hold out, but most people will conform. Finally, another experiment was Stanley Milgram's obedience experiment. In this obedience experiment, what they did is they tried to see, again, remember that obedience is when an authority figure tells you to do something. And so they wanted to see how far people would go in shocking other people. Now, I say shocking in parentheses because they didn't really administer any shocks, but they thought that they would administer shocks. And so what they did is they had 3 people in this. One was the experimenter, and then there was the subject, and this was the person who was going to be performing the shocks. The experimenter was going to be telling the person to perform the shocks. And then there was what we call a confederate, and a confederate is just an actor. And the confederate sat in another room and was connected to the shock board. So what they said is that it was an experiment on punishment and learning, and they had this rigged drawing where the actual subject would always end up being the teacher. And so he would always end up being in this seat, even though he thought it was a random drawing. And then the Confederate, who was would always end up being the learner. So what they were instructed to do was ask the learner some questions. And every time the learner got the question wrong, they would have to go up in shock value. So they would shock them. And then the next one they got wrong, they would have to shock them even more. And so there was a shock platform. I'll show you what that looked like. These are the different levels of shock. It started with slight shock, and then it went up each time by 15 volts there. And the top shock, these were all labeled, by the way, on the shock board: slight shock, moderate shock, strong shock, and so on. The top just said XXX there. And on the XXX, it was presumably very extreme shocks. Well, remember, the other guy is an actor. He's not really getting the shocks, but he's reacting as if he's getting them. So he's actually, as the shocks go up, he starts screaming, and he's just screaming when he gets shocked. And then somewhere around 300 or so, he just falls silent and he doesn't make any more sound. And the question is, do people go on shocking? Well, there's this experimenter that's telling them, you need to give these shocks, please administer the next shock, and so on and so on. And if the learner gets the answer wrong, you have to shock them and stuff like that. Well, it turned out that an amazing number of people, and you can see here, out of 40 people, 26 people went all the way up to 450 volts. 2/3 of people went all the way up. And they shocked this guy, even though they thought he might be dead in the next room, because remember, he wasn't even making a sound. Earlier, he had been screaming. Now he's not making a sound at all. So that really shows you that, in fact, people are very obedient to authority. So just like with conformity, we see this sort of need to, this extreme influence of other people in a situation. Situations influence people very heavily. People will conform to the others around them. And especially when there's an authority figure over them telling them to do something, they have a tendency to go through with that. Perhaps because they think that they are not responsible for it. They feel like the authority figure is the one responsible. So there you have it. That is part of social psychology. We're going to do one more video and have the second half of social psychology. You guys, thank you for your attention, and you have a great day.